Hello and welcome to this review of a Mikhail Botvinnik chess game. So Botvinnik was one of the great world chess champions in the mid 1900s. This game is from 1969, and we'll take a look at this. He's playing against William Lombardi. Or is that? I think it's supposed to be Lombardi, but they have Lombardi on here. Anyway, Botvinnik played with 90% accuracy with the white pieces versus 83% accuracy by his opponent. And Mikhail Botvinnik, according to the computer here, played at a 2650 level versus 2200 by his opponent. So let's see how you can improve your chess by studying Botvinnik. All right, so I have the computer pulled up here. The game begins with c4 and c5 is the response. So we have an English opening with a symmetrical response. So both sides are just pushing this pawn, and it helps to control some valuable squares in the center here. So knight to f3 is played, a sensible developing move, helping to control this square and the other one as well here in the center. And that's always an important idea, to try and control the center by attacking it. And so here the pawn is pushed forward, preparing to fianchetto, and that bishop will be really strong aiming down through the center. So Botvinnik plays e4 here, and this just transposes the opening into something different. We go out of the English opening and into the Sicilian defense, which usually starts with e4, c5, and then knight to f3. And then often this d pawn is pushed forward. So let's see what happens here. The game continues with the bishop developing, and d4 is played. And now after an exchange in the center, we have a Sicilian defense with this Maroczy bind. And if you're not familiar with that, basically you push the c pawn to c4, the e pawn to e4, and both of those pawns lock down this d5 square and really try to discourage black from pushing that pawn to d5. And often if black in the Sicilian defense can push the pawn to d5, it'll kind of free up his game a little bit and make it easier for him. So the game continues with a knight developing move, and Botvinnik just fortifies his knight because now there were two attackers, and with the bishop move he has two defenders. So the game continues with knight attacking the unprotected pawn. Knight develops and defends the pawn. Always a great idea if you can make a move that accomplishes more than one thing. This knight defends the attacked pawn. It also controls valuable squares in the center, and it gets a piece developed off the back rank and into the game. So now we have castling by black, and white develops his other bishop, and he's ready to castle kingside as well. And also this bishop developing here to e2, it helps to control the g4 square, which the queen was covering that as well. But if this pawn moves, the bishop could cover that square and allow the knight to jump forward and harass the e3 bishop here. And often you want to try and exchange these dark squared bishops off the board, leaving dark squared weaknesses around the opponent's king here. And sometimes you can use that to your advantage to get an attack on the king. So the game continues with d6 being played, of course, because d5 would not be possible. It would just be captured here by one of the pawns. Probably the c pawn would capture towards the center. But this move does allow the bishop a chance to start getting developed off the back rank. White castles to the king side, And here we have same side castling. So that'll usually lead to a more strategic game. If white would have tried to castle to the queen side, he probably wouldn't want to do that with this c pawn pushed already. And, of course, this bishop would be aimed right at the queen side. But that is a possibility in the Sicilian defense where white castles to the queen side and black castles king side. And with opposite side castling, you could have more of a crazy game with pawn storms pushing forward towards your opponent's king. But because they both castle to the same side, it's going to be a little more of a strategic game. And Botvinnik, he's a great player. He was probably known more for being a strategic player than somebody like Mikhail Tal, who was a very tactical attacking player. So here we have bishop developing. Now, what will this bishop end up doing? It's helping cover the knight, or there could be an exchange and the bishop could try and reposition here to c6 and aim down towards the king side. Let's see how things continue. All right, the queen is developed, and now it's starting to look like, at some point, maybe you could move this bishop up here and try and trade off the bishops. Unless things go a different way, let's find out. All right, the knight captures in the center, bishop recaptures, and now this can be a common move. The computer says it's an inaccuracy here that A5 is what the computer prefers. And I see that quite a bit in modern chess where the chess masters are using a lot of computer analysis, and the computers really seem to like these pawn pushes on the flank. A5 and H5 for black, and then A4 and H4 for white. I guess it, solidifies the space, or tries to gain more space if your opponent doesn't oppose you by pushing that pawn on the flank. So another idea behind this queen move here is that it lines up on this unprotected queen here. So, there could be a possible attempt to capture here, and the knight wouldn't be able to recapture because, I'll take that back. If the knight captured, I guess he could try to capture, but, if you take, the knight could retake, but then again, you got this as well. The bishop would be unprotected. So the pressure is building up here. And this is a common move to develop the queen off to the side here and just line up on the other queen in case they decide to exchange off. So now we have rook to the center here, helping back up the unprotected queen. The game continues with black placing a rook on the half-open file, putting some pressure on this pawn. But it's usually a good idea to put your rooks on open or half-open files where they have more mobility. So the game continues with an interesting move, which the computer says is an inaccuracy here. But things get a little more interesting now. Usually, you don't want to exchange this dark squared bishop with the knight. It's usually a better idea to try and trade it off, like I said, for the dark squared bishop. But Botvinnik has something different in mind here. He captures, and after this recapture, which is best because you don't want to, of course, capture with the pawn, breaking your pawns apart, and then the queen could just capture that. So the game continues with the best move here, threatening that bishop. And often in chess, you want to try and keep the bishop pair. If your opponent has knocked out your bishop pair, it can be a good idea to try and get rid of their bishop pair, because that can be an advantage for black, having this dark squared bishop here, especially lining up here if the queens are traded. Anyway, before I get into this too crazy on what didn't happen, let's see what actually happened in the game. We have a queen exchange here, but instead of just capturing, it looks like Botvinnik does an in-between move here. He captures the bishop with check, so that has to be dealt with first. And now we have the king, stepping forward here, attacking the knight. Now white, has to try and get his get black's queen back. So we have the knight, which was under attack by the king, moving off to the edge of the board. And there's that old saying, a knight on the rim is dim. But here, there's a good idea for breaking that rule. The knight is captured, to keep material even. But look at the pawn structure over here. You have these two isolated doubled pawns, and they're on the H-file, so not too good for black there. And the bishop is capturing. So first we have the rook recapturing that queen finally. And after all this mess, let's see, what is actually happening in this position. Well, black has a rook on the half-open file targeting this pawn, which is protected by the bishop at the moment. The bishop is also targeting black's unprotected pawn. So if he takes that h5 pawn, the rook would be able to take this more valuable central, well, not quite central. The e-pawn is central, but this c-pawn is covering a valuable square on d5. So the game continues with f6 being played, although the computer prefers rook to c5, which would guard that pawn, but how good is that move? If the rook tries to stay on this 5th rank, the pawn could jump up here, chasing it, and where would the rook go? The pawns could just keep attacking and chasing that rook away, and he wouldn't be able to protect this pawn. So instead, he just forgets about that pawn, pushes his f-pawn. Botvinnik could take the h5 pawn, but instead, he wants to keep that more valuable c4 pawn, so he fortifies it with his b pawn, and the game continues with rook to c5. Now the pawn is protected, and we have f4 being played. The computer states that this is the best move in the position. I guess it helps fortify the center, this e5 pawn, in case these pawns want to push forward and gain space. But, this pawn kind of has to stay on e7 to guard the d6 pawn. So the game continues with rooks doubling. But how much can these rooks do here? Because that c pawn is just blocking everything. If this pawn tries to push forward, how can that be achieved? At the moment, it'll just be captured. If you try to maybe bring this pawn up, but then you have to protect this if you move the e7 pawn. So the game continues with rook to e1. So what is this move doing? Maybe thinking about a future fork of the king and the bishop, perhaps, if things clear up in the center with all these pawns. So now we have the bishop retreating back, helping protect this pawn, taking this rook off of guard duty. So the game continues with a bishop retreat by Botvinnik, allowing his rook more freedom if it has to move up the board here. So the game continues with the bishop repositioning, aiming down here at the d5 square. And I mentioned that d5 is always well, not always, but usually a important move in the Sicilian. It kind of frees black's game up a little bit. And with the Maroczy bind having pawns here on c4 and e4, that really makes it difficult to try and push that pawn to d5 for black. All right, the king is trying to get into the action, which that is very important as you head into an endgame and the pieces are fewer and fewer on the board. You want to try and get your king involved to help. That can make all the difference in winning an endgame. So we have a6 here, maybe with the thought of pushing to b5 and trying to put pressure on that c pawn. The game continues with rook jumping up the board. Here it has a little more mobility. It could move over and even check perhaps, or go after this pawn on h5. So the game continues with rook lining up here, kind of limiting what this rook can do, because it has to guard that pawn. So the game continues with a4 taking care of that problem and gaining space on the queen side. The rook just jumps back to where it was. And at this point, white has almost a 3/4 pawn advantage, even though material is actually even at the moment. And the game continues with the best move found by Botvinnik. He just adds a little bit of pressure on this pawn, which, this pawn is okay at the moment. It's guarded. But, if this pawn pushes forward, it'll chase the rook away and that pawn could fall. But we have a bishop guarding it as well. So, all right. The final moves in the game. The rook steps forward here. We have a check by Botvinnik's rook on g3, and the king steps back. Apparently, the computer likes king to h6 better, helping guard that h5 pawn. But the king would really be stuck there because of this rook. If the king was stuck on h6. Okay, the game continues with more pressure being added here, but you have two attackers and two defenders, so that pawn is okay for the moment. So the game continues with a rook move, an inaccuracy according to the computer, giving white even more of an advantage. They liked king to g7 better, maybe with the idea of king to h6 to help guard this. So the game continues with the pawn pressing forward, blocking the path of that defensive rook. And now we have a counter attack here. So, if this rook, if we have a trade or a capture of this pawn, black can counterattack perhaps if this rook moves. So the game continues with the other rook adding, an extra layer of defense here. So the game continues here with the first mistake. I think that was the first, actually, we had some inaccuracies, but I think this was the first mistake of the game, and that jumps white's advantage to +1.5. Like I said, even though material is even, the computer evaluates white as better here by a fair amount. So, before I go on, let's see what the computer liked best. Apparently, rook to e5, putting pressure on this undefended pawn. But, it looks like that would be possible to defend that in a few different ways. I guess this rook could go here maybe. Anyway, the game continues with a capture. We have, now this is an important strategy in chess. White has gone ahead by an extra pawn after capturing on h5. And there was a chance to exchange bishops there. Botvinnik's opponent wisely avoided that trade, because once you're down in material, you want to avoid piece trades and try and trade pawns off. Whereas Botvinnik, being ahead in material, he wants to try and trade pieces and use his extra pawn advantage in the endgame, to get that pawn promoted. So we have rook to h4, an inaccuracy. The computer preferred what? Rook to c3. So rook to c3 was preferred, but white is still ahead pretty good here. So we have e6, another mistake by Botvinnik's opponent, but he's trying to exchange pawns off. The computer actually liked what here? b5, exchanging off pawns over here. So the game continues with capture, recapture. The bishop repositions down here, guarding this pawn, freeing up the other rook for maybe an attack here on this pawn. So the game continues with the bishop retreating, although they like h5 the best, and it looks like they don't even want you to try and defend this unprotected pawn in the center. So Botvinnik takes that, the king attacks the rook, and we have a rook retreat, the best move in the position here. So rook centralizes. We have an attack on the unprotected bishop. So that bishop steps forward. And we're going into the final moves of the game here. At this point, it looks like Botvinnik has a winning advantage. He is at, plus 3.5 here, even though it's a, 2-pawn game. He has 2 extra pawns. So the final moves, we have a pin of the bishop to the king here. The pawn was also under attack, so it steps forward. Now the rook gets behind the passed pawn, and that's usually, or not passed pawn, gets behind the pawn that he's threatening to capture, and that's usually a good strategy. The computer recommends pushing that pawn where it would be protected by bishop and rook, but the opponent instead retreats back with his rook. Now, I'm not sure what the idea was behind that move. It says it's still a good move, but once again, pushing that pawn forward would have been better. So maybe the idea is that if that is captured, this could be pushed forward, with a discovered attack. But, I don't know. This bishop move now kind of helps cover that, and it's attacking the rook. So, the final moves. The king retreats here, breaking this pin, but it's not looking so good here. It's looking, horrible for Botvinnik's opponent. So the last few moves of the game are check. We have a block by the bishop, another check. This is a missed opportunity. Apparently there was a mate in 2 with Bishop takes e6. Well, I guess this is a mate in 3 at this point. But it looks like this would have been better. Capture. Then what do they recommend? H5, F5, A5. Let's say if they do that, well, now you have another check, king to g8, and capture of the bishop with a mate. So that did not happen in the game. After this bishop to e8 retreating move, which was a mistake, we have check, a missed opportunity, but Botvinnik is still winning by a huge amount anyway. The king steps forward, and that was the best move in the position. And this is where his opponent must have just resigned because it's not looking so good. Botvinnik could capture this, and then if the king recaptures, the rook goes here and captures, and Botvinnik would just have a huge advantage. All right, well, I hope you found this interesting. Feel free to leave comments, with anything you have to say. I always enjoy hearing from viewers and subscribers. And if you have a request for anything you'd like to see in the future, put that in the comments as well. And remember, if you're trying to improve, study the games of past chess masters. You can study, depending on your level. If you're a lower rated player, the older games are a little easier to understand because today the modern chess masters use a lot of computer evaluation and they find really complicated lines that are harder to follow. Start out with older games like these, and hopefully it'll really help you improve your chess by learning from these past masters. All right, as I said, feel free to leave comments, like, and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.